The Puppet's Curse Revealed, Confronting Your Darkest Secrets. Chapter 1. The Arrival. The small town of Whitmore had always seemed to be trapped in a time gone by. Cobblestone streets and weathered facades whispering of an age when horse-drawn carriages were the norm, and gas lamps illuminated the dusky corners. Victor Ashcroft's arrival was an intrusion into this delicate stillness, a jarring disruption in a town that had long seemed content to sleep through centuries. The theater stood at the end of Ashbury Lane, a narrow, winding road flanked by dense, tangled hedges and twisted trees that seemed to lean inwards, casting long shadows in the early afternoon light. Its exterior was draped in a shroud of neglect. Peeling paint and sagging shutters lent the building a mournful, spectral quality. Even the sign that once proclaimed Ashcroft Theater was barely legible, as though it too had succumbed to the slow decay of time. Victor Ashcroft, a tall man with a gaunt face and a heavy overcoat, stood on the threshold of the theater, clutching a leather satchel in one hand. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, surveyed the crumbling facade with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. The inheritance of the theater had come as a surprise, a twist of fate he had not anticipated, and as he gazed upon the edifice before him, he could not shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far beyond the realm of mere inheritance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp and mildew. The grand foyer, once a bustling entryway for patron, now lay in a state of dusty desolation. Ancient chandeliers, their crystals dimmed by years of neglect, hung forlornly from the ceiling, casting ghostly shadows on the faded velvet of the walls. The floorboards creaked underfoot, their groans echoing through the empty space as Victor made his way further into the building. The stage was visible through an archway at the end of the hall. As Victor approached, he could not help but marvel the grandeur that had once characterized the theater. The ornate curtains, though tattered, still bore traces of their former splendor, and the velvet seats, now covered in a thick layer of dust, seemed to beckon with a distant memory of applause and laughter. Victor began to unpack his belongings methodically. His marionettes, carefully wrapped in layers of fabric, were placed on the stage one by one. They were beautiful but unsettling creation, their wooden faces painted with an unsettling mixture of joy and sorrow. Each puppet seemed to carry its own air of melancholy, as though the very essence of the theater's past had been trapped within them. As he worked, Victor couldn't shake the sense of being watched. There was a palpable unease in the building, an oppressive silence that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. It was as though the theater itself were aware of his presence, ancient timbers creaking in protest at the intrusion. Margaret Linton, the theater's caretaker, arrived just as Victor was setting up the last of the marionettes. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a countenance that reflected years of tending to the theater's many secrets. Her hair, silver and neatly pinned, was a stark contrast to the dark, rumpled garments she wore. She moved with a deliberate, almost reverent grace, as though she were accustomed to navigating the thin line between the past and the present. "Mr. Ashcroft, I presume?" Margaret's voice was soft, yet it carried an undertone of authority. Victor turned to face her, gaze steady. "Yes, that's right. Margaret Linton, I assume?" She nodded, her eyes flickering with something Victor couldn't quite place. Perhaps a shadow of apprehension or a glimmer of caution. "I've come to offer my assistance and, more importantly, to give you some advice about this place." Victor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Advice?" Margaret glanced around the theater, her expression growing more solemn. "This theater has a history, one that many would rather forget. It has a way of affecting those who come here, especially those who disturb the remnants of its past." Victor's curiosity was piqued. "What sort of history?" Margaret's eyes grew distant, as though she were recalling something from long ago. "There are stories, whispers of strange occurrences, things that cannot be easily explained. The marionettes you see on the stage, they are not mere toys. They have been part of this place for a very long time, and they have a way of behaving oddly, especially when the theater is disturbed." Victor's gaze shifted back to the marionettes. The puppets, with their painted eyes and delicate movements, seemed almost alive in the dim light. He could not deny that there was something unsettling about them, something that went beyond their mechanical charm. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm a man of reason," Victor said, his voice firm. "I believe that everything can be explained with a little investigation." Margaret's gaze softened slightly, but her concern remained. "Just be cautious. This theater has seen more than its share of misfortune. Sometimes, it is better to leave well enough alone." With that, Margaret took her leave, her footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Victor was left alone with his thoughts and the lingering sense of unease that seemed to seep from the very walls of the theater. As evening fell and the last of the daylight was swallowed by the encroaching night, Victor continued to work. The marionettes, now arranged on the stage, seemed to take on a more distinct presence in the gloom. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the theater seemed to deepen, twisting and curling like living entities. Victor, though he tried to remain focused on his task, could not shake the feeling that he was being observed. It was not the subtle, intrusive gaze of a stranger, but something far more ancient and inscrutable. Presence that had watched over this place for decades, if not centuries. As he finally completed his preparations and prepared to leave for the night, Victor could not help but cast one last glance at the stage. The marionettes stood in eerie stillness, their eyes reflecting the dim light from above. And as he turned to leave, he felt a shiver run down his spine, as though the theater itself were whispering a silent warning to him, urging him to heed the caution that had been so carefully laid before him. With a final, lingering look at the silent stage, Victor stepped out of the theater and into the encroaching darkness, unaware of the sinister changes that were already beginning to stir within the depths of the old building. Chapter 2. Performance begins. The old theater, once cloaked in silence and dust, had been meticulously revived for the evening's performance. The air was heavy with a mixture of fresh varnish and the lingering, musty scent of decades past. The stage was lit with soft, warm lights, casting a glow that brought a semblance of life to the tarnished velvet curtains and faded grandeur of the space. Victor Ashcroft, standing behind the stage, took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the meticulously arranged marionettes. Alina, his assistant, bustled around the backstage area with an enthusiasm that was both infectious and tinged with nervousness. She was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with a mop of curly hair that bounced as she moved. Her eyes sparkled with anticipation, yet a flicker of apprehension lingered at the corners. It was her first performance in this grand old theater, and she had been charged with the task of ensuring everything went smoothly. "Everything's ready, Mr. Ashcroft," Elena said, her voice barely containing her excitement. She looked at him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, her hands nervously smoothing out imaginary wrinkles on her costume. Victor nodded, his expression a mask of calmness. "Very well. Let's hope the audience appreciates the effort." As the house lights dimmed and the soft murmur of the crowd fell to an expectant hush, Victor moved to the front of the stage. His hands, steady but cautious, began to manipulate the marionettes with practiced precision. The opening scene of the performance unfolded, a tale of fantastical creatures and dramatic escapades, brought to life by the intricate movements of the wooden puppets. The audience, seated in the velvety shadows of the theater, was visibly captivated. Gasps and whispers of admiration punctuated the quiet, their eyes fixed on the stage as the marionettes danced and enacted their roles with an almost uncanny grace. Strings, though invisible to the spectators, seemed to vanish as the puppets moved with a fluidity that suggested a life of their own. Victor watched from the shadows of the stage, his focus intent. As he worked, he began to notice something disconcerting. The marionettes, despite their lifelike movements, seemed to exhibit an unnerving responsiveness. Their gestures, although meticulously planned, took on an eerie precision, as though they were anticipating his thoughts rather than merely following his command. The delicate movements of the puppets became increasingly deliberate, their actions seeming almost too synchronized with Victor's own emotional state. It was as if the marionettes were reflecting his innermost thoughts, their movements betraying a level of understanding that defied the mechanical. During a particularly dramatic scene where the leading puppet, a regal figure adorned in a tattered cloak, was supposed to display a moment of anguish, Victor found himself lost in the depth of the character's portrayal. Puppet's performance was strikingly perfect, its gestures mirroring Victor's own emotional turmoil with a haunting accuracy. Elena, observing from the side, noticed Victor's growing unease. She approached him cautiously, her voice a soft whisper. "Is everything all right, Mr. Ashcroft? You seem tense." Victor forced a smile, though it did little to ease the knot forming in his stomach. "Just a bit of stage fright, I suppose. Let's keep going." As the performance continued, Victor could not ignore the mounting sense of discomfort. The marionettes' movements became increasingly erratic, their expressions shifting in a way that seemed almost sentient. The audience, absorbed in the spectacle, remained oblivious to the subtle disturbances unfolding on stage. In the quieter moments of the performance, when the stage was dimly lit and the marionettes stood still, Victor could almost sense a presence in the room, a lingering, almost imperceptible force that seemed to hover just beyond the reach of rational explanation. It was as though the theater itself was breathing with a rhythm that resonated with the marionette's own unsettling choreography. The final act approached, climax that was meant to leave the audience in awe. As Victor prepared for the grand finale, the marionettes, now seemingly imbued with an eerie vitality, moved with an unnerving precision. Their movements were synchronized not just with Victor's own manipulations, but with an invisible force that seemed to guide their every gesture. As the final curtain fell, the audience erupted into applause, their cheers and claps filling the theater with a vibrant energy. Victor, however, could not shake the lingering sense of unease. The marionettes, now at rest, seemed to hold a subtle, knowing expression, as though they were privy to a secret that Victor himself could not comprehend. Elena, bustling with excitement, congratulated Victor on a successful performance. "That was incredible, Mr. Ashcroft. The audience loved it. I think we've made a great impression." Victor managed a strained smile, his thoughts preoccupied with the unsettling experience. "Yes, it went well, but there's something peculiar about these puppets." Elena's expression shifted from one of exuberance to concern. "Peculiar? How so?" Victor hesitated, unsure how to articulate the disquieting sensations he had experienced. "It's hard to explain. The puppets seemed to move with an unusual precision, almost as if they were reacting to something beyond my control." Elena's brow furrowed. "You don't think—" "No," Victor interrupted, shaking his head. "I don't believe in superstitions, but there's definitely something strange about this place." As the theater began to empty and the audience filed out into the night, Victor remained on the stage, staring at the marionettes with a growing sense of apprehension. The night's performance had been a success, but the subtle, disquieting presence that had accompanied him throughout the evening left him with more questions than answers. The theater, now once again draped in shadows and silence, seemed to hold its breath. Victor's mind raced as he contemplated the strange occurrences. He had hoped that the performance would bring a sense of normalcy and control, but instead, it had only deepened the mystery. With a final, lingering glance at the marionettes, Victor extinguished the stage lights, and retreated backstage. The sense of unease that had settled over him was not easily shaken. As he prepared to leave the theater for the night, he could not ignore the feeling that the shadows held secrets yet to be uncovered. And as the doors of the theater closed behind him, sealing the building in darkness, marionettes remained on their stage, their wooden eyes reflecting the dim light with an eerie, knowing gleam. Chapter 3: The Unseen Force. The theater was cloaked in an oppressive gloom as the late afternoon sky darkened. Heavy clouds roiled above, casting a pall over the town of Whitmore, and the first hints of rain began to patter against the windows. The atmosphere within the theater mirrored the storm brewing outside. Thick, uneasy silence that seemed to weigh on the air like a tangible presence. Victor Ashcroft paced the empty stage, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast, shadowed space. The rehearsal had been unsettling. The marionettes had moved with an eerie autonomy, their actions seemingly dictated by an unseen force rather than Victor's own manipulation. Performance, once a display of Victor's craftsmanship, had become a disturbing spectacle, with the puppets' movements taking on a life of their own. Elena, observing from the wings, could not conceal her concern. Mr. Ashcroft, the puppets are acting strangely again. It's as if they're not responding to the strings. Victor sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I've noticed. It's as if they have a will of their own. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the backstage door. Elena opened it to reveal Edgar, a local historian whose reputation for delving into Whitmore's past was well known. He was a thin man with a scholarly demeanor. His attire, marked by a slight disarray, suggested he had spent hours poring over old documents. His eyes, hidden behind half-moon spectacles, gleamed with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Ashcroft? Edgar's voice was quiet, but carried an edge of urgency. I've heard about the peculiarities of your performance. May I have a word? Victor gestured for Edgar to enter. His interest piqued. Certainly, I could use some insight into what's happening here. Edgar settled into a chair, his gaze shifting to the stage where the marionettes still stood, their wooden forms catching the dim light in unsettling ways. I've been researching the history of this theater for years. It has a reputation for, let's say, unusual occurrences. Victor arched an eyebrow. Unusual occurrences? Yes, Edgar said, his voice dropping to a whisper. There are old tales of a curse associated with this place. It's said that a dark force manipulates the marionettes, causing them to move on their own. The stories go back a long way, and while many dismiss them as mere folklore, there's a recurring theme. The theater has a history of bringing out the worst in those who disturb its secret. Victor's skepticism was evident. You're suggesting that these are not just mechanical issues, but something supernatural? Edgar nodded solemnly. Precisely. The curse, if you believe in such things, is said to be linked to the original owner of the theater, a man who dabbled in forbidden arts and who met a grim fate. According to the stories, his spirit lingers here, bound to the theater and influencing the marionettes. Victor's expression hardened with disbelief. I appreciate the historical context, but I'm not inclined to accept supernatural explanations. Marionette's behavior might simply be a result of some mechanical fault or an issue with the strings. Edgar's eyes flickered with a mixture of frustration and concern. It's not just mechanical faults. The way the puppets move, the patterns they form, they're consistent with the tales of the curse. I've seen enough to believe that something more is at work here. Victor's gaze drifted to the marionettes, their stillness now seeming almost deliberate. What kind of influence are we talking about? What exactly happens when this force takes hold? Edgar leaned forward, voice low. The curse is said to manipulate the puppets in ways that reflect the darker aspects of human nature. The marionettes become more than mere figures. They take on a life of their own, acting out scenes of conflict and anguish. It's as though they're reflecting the deepest fears and desires of those who interact with them. As Edgar spoke, a sudden gust of wind rattled the theater's windows, and the lights flickered momentarily. Elena, standing nearby, shivered visibly. The theater feels different tonight, like it's alive. Victor frowned, feeling a twinge of unease. I can't deny that something is off. The marionettes have moved with an unsettling precision, as though they are reacting to more than just my direction. Edgar's expression grew more intense. You should be cautious. There are tales of performers who have been driven to madness or worse by the curse. The marionettes are indeed being influenced by a dark force. It might not be long before the theater demands something from you in return. Victor's skepticism was starting to waver, but he forced himself to remain composed. I need to see this through. The performance is just beginning, and I can't let superstitions dictate my actions. Edgar sighed, clearly conflicted. I understand, but be aware that you are not just dealing with a malfunctioning set of marionettes. If the curse is real, then the theater has already begun to exert its influence. It's a powerful force, and it will not be easily dismissed. With that, Edgar took his leave, leaving Victor and Elena alone in the dimly lit theater. Air was thick with tension, and the once familiar space now seemed to pulse with a strange, almost palpable energy. Victor's thoughts churned as he watched the marionettes, their wooden eyes seemingly glinting with an eerie awareness. He could not shake the feeling that the theater was more than just a backdrop for his performance. It was an active participant, its dark presence casting a long shadow over everything he did. As the storm outside gathered strength, the theater seemed to mirror its fury. The gusts of wind howling through the rafters and the rain beating against the windows with increasing intensity. The marionettes stood motionless on the stage, their expressions frozen in a haunting tableau. Elena, her face pale, approached Victor. "What do we do now?" Victor turned to her, his expression reflecting a mixture of determination and apprehension. "We continue with the rehearsals. I need to understand what's happening here, even if it means confronting whatever force is behind it." Elena nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. "I'll help however I can. But please, be careful. There's something unsettling about this place." Victor gave her a reassuring nod, though he could not completely dispel the sense of unease that had settled over him. The theater, with its creaking walls and flickering lights, seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of its dark history to unfold. As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Victor and Elena returned to their preparations, unaware that the true extent of the theater's curse was only beginning to reveal itself. The marionettes, their wooden forms casting eerie shadows on the stage, seemed to wait in anticipation, their movements a silent testament to the dark force that had begun to exert its influence. Victor's resolve was firm, but the shadows in the theater grew longer, and the feeling of being watched became more pronounced. Curse, if it indeed existed, was a force to be reckoned with, and as the marionettes stirred with an unsettling life of their own, Victor knew that he was on the brink of discovering just how deep the theater's darkness truly went. Chapter 4. The Haunting. The theater, once a grand stage of artistic expression, now seemed to be cloaked in a mantle of malevolence. The oppressive atmosphere was as palpable as the encroaching darkness that had taken hold of the space. Each creak of the floorboards and rustle of the old curtains seemed to carry an air of foreboding, heightening Victor Ashcroft's growing sense of paranoia. The nightly rehearsals had taken on a nightmarish quality. The marionettes, previously under Victor's skilled control, now seemed to act independently, their movements disturbingly autonomous. What had begun as subtle irregularities had spiraled into full-blown phenomena. Puppets danced and gestured with an unnerving precision, even when Victor was not manipulating them directly. The strings, once a reliable tether to reality, seemed to be losing their grip on the marionette's action. One evening, as Victor prepared for yet another rehearsal, he was startled by a series of peculiar sounds emanating from backstage. The noises were faint at first, an odd scraping sound, like something wooden being dragged across the floor. As he ventured into the dimly lit backstage area, he was met with an unsettling sight. The marionettes, which had been neatly arranged in their storage spaces, were now scattered about, their positions altered as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Victor's heart raced as he attempted to reassemble the puppets. The sense of being watched grew stronger, the walls of the theater seeming to close in on him. The once familiar space now felt alien and hostile, every shadow and creak amplifying his growing unease. Elena, having noticed the shift in Victor's demeanor, approached him cautiously. "Mr. Ashcroft, are you all right? You seem—" "I'm fine," Victor cut her off abruptly. "Just dealing with some issues." Elena hesitated but said nothing more. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, the weight of the theater's presence bearing down on her as well. As days turned into nights, Victor's paranoia intensified. The marionette's behavior became increasingly erratic. Strange occurrences, unexplained movements, eerie whispers, and objects seemingly shifted by invisible forces plagued the theater. Victor could no longer dismiss these incidents as mere mechanical faults or the figments of his imagination. Determined to uncover the root of the disturbances, Victor began a thorough investigation of the theater. He scoured every inch of the building, from the dusty attic filled with old costumes to the dank, forgotten storage rooms. His efforts led him to a series of hidden compartments within the theater, concealed behind walls and beneath floorboards. The discovery of these hidden spaces was as chilling as it was illuminating. Victor unearthed old, yellowed manuscripts and worn journals that had been meticulously stored away. The pages were filled with cryptic notations and archaic symbols, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. Among them was an assortment of scripts that were markedly different from the ones Victor was accustomed to. scripts with unsettling themes of darkness, possession, and malevolence. One particular journal stood out, its leather cover cracked and brittle. The handwriting inside was hasty and erratic, reflecting the turmoil of its author. Victor read through the entries with mounting dread. The puppets are not mere tools of entertainment. They are vessels for a force that thrives on despair and manipulation. I have seen it move through the theater, through the strings, into the souls of those who dare to perform. It demands more than respect, demands a sacrifice. Victor's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The journal detailed a series of events that matched the strange occurrences Victor had been experiencing. It spoke of a curse that had been placed upon the theater, one that was awakened by the performance of certain rituals or plays. The marionettes, it seemed, were not just inanimate objects, but conduits for a dark force that could influence and control. As Victor continued to delve into the journal, he stumbled upon a detailed description of the very marionettes that now troubled him. The author described them as receptacles for the will of the malevolent entity, their actions and behaviors manipulated by the dark force that resided in the theater. The journal's author had gone mad, their final entries scribbled in frantic scrawls, warning of the theater's power to ensnare those who dared to unravel its secret. The more Victor read, the more he felt the weight of the theater's curse pressing down upon him. Eerie coincidences, the uncanny movements of the marionettes, the unsettling sounds, everything began to make a terrible kind of sense. The theater was not merely haunted, it was alive with a dark force that thrived on fear and confusion. Determined to confront the darkness, Victor made his way to the theater's basement, a place he had previously avoided due to its damp, musty conditions. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and forgotten relics, and it was here that he hoped to find more answers. As he descended the creaking stairs, the air grew colder, and a sense of foreboding wrapped around him like a shroud. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Victor's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing old trunks and dusty crates stacked haphazardly. In a corner of the basement, Victor discovered an old trunk, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. He pried it open, revealing a collection of odd, ritualistic objects. Candles, amulets, and ancient manuscripts. The items seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though they were waiting for someone to disturb them. Among the artifacts was a box containing a series of old photographs, each depicting the theater in various states of decay and renovation. One photograph, however, caught Victor's eye. It showed a group of people, their faces obscured, standing before a stage similar to his own. The figures were holding marionettes, and the puppets' eyes seemed to follow Victor's gaze with an unsettling intensity. As Victor examined the photograph, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The realization dawned upon him that the curse was not merely a story or a superstition. It was a living, breathing entity that had taken hold of the theater. The marionettes, once mere objects of art, had become vessels for this malevolent force. The sound of a distant, mournful wail echoed through the basement, and Victor's flashlight flickered erratically. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and he could see his breath forming misty clouds in the cold air. He could almost feel the presence of something dark and ancient, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Victor stumbled back, his mind racing with the implications of his finding. Curse was real, and it was far more sinister than he had imagined. The theater was not just haunted, it was a conduit for a dark power that sought to control and destroy. As he made his way back to the main stage, Victor's resolve hardened. He knew that he could no longer ignore the presence that had taken hold of the theater. The marionettes, the strange occurrences, and the dark history all pointed to a malevolent force that demanded confrontation. Elena, who had been waiting anxiously backstage, greeted Victor with a worried expression. "Mr. Ashcroft, what's happening? You look disturbed." Victor's eyes met hers with a mixture of fear and determination. "Elena, the theater is not just a building. It's a vessel for something dark and powerful. The marionettes are part of it, and I need to find a way to break the curse before it consumes us all." Elena's face paled as she listened to Victor's revelations. "What can we do?" Victor took a deep breath. his mind already working through the steps he needed to take. We need to understand more about the curse and the entity controlling the marionettes. We'll have to perform a thorough investigation, and we might need to seek help from experts who can deal with this kind of darkness. As the rain continued to pound against the theater's windows and the storm outside raged on, Victor and Elena prepared themselves for the daunting task ahead. Theater, now fully aware of its own malevolence, seemed to brace itself for the confrontation that was to come. The haunting presence was growing stronger, and the marionettes, with their lifelike eyes and eerie movements, awaited the next chapter in their dark and twisted saga. The theater, with all its secrets and curses, was about to reveal its final, terrifying truth. Chapter 5. Revelation. The storm outside raged with renewed ferocity, casting flickering shadows across the old theater as Victor Ashcroft and Elena descended into the hidden room that had been discovered in the basement. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the scent of mildew and the unmistakable tang of ancient dust. The room was a sepulchral vault, its walls adorned with arcane symbols and cluttered with esoteric artifacts that had not seen the light of day for decades. Victor's flashlight illuminated the grim tableau, a chaotic assemblage of old texts, mysterious relics, and faded diagrams. The room seemed to hum with an unspoken energy, presence that Victor could almost feel crawling over his skin. The very atmosphere was saturated with a dark, oppressive weight, as if the walls themselves were alive with the whispers of forgotten pacts and ancient rites. Elena followed close behind, her face pale and eyes wide with apprehension. "Mr. Ashcroft, what are we looking for?" Victor, his gaze fixed on a dusty trunk in the corner of the room, nodded towards it. "There has to be something here that explains everything. Origins of the curse, the nature of the marionettes. We need to find out what's binding this dark force to the theater." The trunk, bound with iron straps and covered in a thick layer of grime, looked as though it had been untouched for generations. Victor approached it with a mixture of trepidation and determination, carefully prying open the heavy lid. Inside, he found a collection of old manuscripts and a single leather-bound journal. The journal's cover was embossed with an intricate design of interlocking symbols, their meanings obscured by age. Victor picked up the journal with trembling hands, the weight of its significance pressing heavily upon him. He flipped through the brittle pages, each filled with a meticulous, almost obsessive script. The entries were written in a flowing, cursive hand, their content revealing a chilling account of the theater's history. The pact was made in shadows, a bargain sealed with an entity beyond mortal comprehension. The marionettes, crafted with care, are not mere puppets, but vessels of power and control. Each performance, each movement, is a step towards fulfilling the bargain. The souls trapped within the theater are the price of our success. Victor's breath quickened as he read on, his mind racing to absorb the implication. The journal belonged to Horace Blackwood, the theater's original owner, who had once been celebrated as a master puppeteer. Blackwood's success had been legendary, his performances renowned for their dark allure and haunting beauty. But the true source of his power, as Victor was now discovering, was far more sinister. The marionettes are alive in ways that defy comprehension. They serve as conduits for the entity's will, their movements driven by a force that demands sacrifice. The pact requires that each puppeteer, upon taking up the mantle, must bind their own soul to the entity's will. Failure to comply will result in the loss of one's own humanity, consumed by the darkness that resides within. Victor's hands shook as he turned the pages, full horror of Blackwood's revelations sinking in. The marionettes, which had once been a source of artistic pride, were now revealed to be instruments of a malevolent power. The curse was not merely a superstition. It was a binding force, designed to trap and consume. To break the curse, one must confront the entity directly, severing the bond forged through the pact. The marionettes will resist, for they are bound to the darkness, as are we. But the price of liberation is great, and the cost may well be one's own soul. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he processed the implications of Blackwood's words. The marionettes were not just puppets but active agents of the curse, their movements a reflection of the entity's will. The theater was a stage for an ongoing ritual, and Victor was now a part of that dark performance. Elena, sensing the gravity of Victor's discovery, stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What does this mean, Mr. Ashcroft? How do we stop them?" Victor closed the journal with a heavy sigh, the weight of his newfound knowledge pressing down on him. "The Marionettes are seeking to claim me. They are conduits for the entity's will, and their behavior has been driven by the need to draw me into the curse. The only way to break free is to confront the entity itself, to sever the bond that ties us all to this darkness." Elena's face was ashen, eyes wide with fear. "But how can we confront something like that? It's beyond our understanding." Victor's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of the journal's revelations. "We need to perform a ritual to sever the bond, but we must first locate the entity's source, part of the curse. The theater holds secrets that may reveal its true nature." As Victor and Elena made their way back to the main stage, the atmosphere of the theater seemed to pulse with a menacing energy. The marionettes, their eyes glinting in the dim light, geared to watch their every move with an unsettling intensity. Victor knew that time was running out. Curse was growing stronger, influence over the marionettes more pronounced with each passing day. He had to act swiftly if he was to break the pact and free himself from the entity's grasp. The hidden room, now a repository of dark secrets and ominous revelations, had offered a glimpse into the true nature of the curse. But the full extent of the theater's malevolence remained shrouded in darkness. Victor and Elena were about to embark on a journey into the heart of the curse, a journey that would test their resolve and confront them with the darkest corners of their own souls. As the storm outside continued its relentless assault, the theater seemed to brace itself for the impending confrontation. The marionettes, poised and waiting, were about to become the center of a final, harrowing performance. Performance that would reveal the ultimate truth of the curse and determine the fate of all involved. Chapter 6: The Confrontation and Twist. The theater had transformed into a grotesque reflection of Victor Ashcroft's innermost fears. The once quaint and charming space was now an unsettling stage for a nightmarish performance. Shadows writhed along the walls, and the once ornate stage seemed to distort and contort as if in agony. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, an almost tangible sense of foreboding that pressed down upon everyone present. Victor, his face pale and drawn, stood in the center of the stage, surrounded by the marionettes that had plagued him with their unnatural movements. The audience, an assortment of shadowy figures, was silent, their faces obscured by the darkness that seemed to envelop the theater. Elena, trembling in the wings, watched with a mixture of fear and hope, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the stage. Victor's hands gripped the strings of the marionettes tightly, his heart pounding as he prepared for the final confrontation. The journal's revelations had left him with no illusions about the nature of the curse. The entity that controlled the puppets was not an external force, but a manifestation of his own unspoken guilt and repressed memories. The marionette's movements, once so unnervingly precise, were now a reflection of his own inner turmoil. As the performance began, Victor's fingers moved mechanically, guiding the marionettes through their motions with a sense of detached precision. The puppets seemed to respond with an eerie synchronicity, their movements mirroring Victor's emotions, disturbing accuracy. The once coordinated dance now took on a sinister edge, their movements becoming erratic and chaotic, as if struggling against some invisible force. Victor's gaze was drawn to the central puppet, a lifelike figure, bore a haunting resemblance to his deceased family. The puppet's eyes, cold and unblinking, seemed to pierce through him with a judgmental glare. It was then that Victor understood the true nature of the curse. It was not the puppets themselves that were cursed, a burden of his own unresolved trauma. The performance reached its climax, and Victor felt an almost unbearable pressure building within him. The marionettes, once mere tools of his craft, had become instruments of his deepest fears. Their movements, driven by an unknown force, seemed to mock his every attempt to control them. In a final, desperate act, Victor dropped the strings and stepped forward, confronting the source of the dark force head-on. The stage seemed to warp and shift around him, and the audience, now revealed to be specters of his past, stared at him with accusing eyes. The puppet that bore the likeness of his family began to speak, its voice an eerie echo of long-forgotten conversations. "Victor," it intoned, voice trembling with the weight of sorrow and reproach. "You've ignored us for so long. Your guilt has bound us to this place, to this cursed existence." Victor's heart raced as he realized the full scope of his burden. The curse was not an external force, but a reflection of his own guilt, a manifestation of his unresolved grief over his family's tragic death. The Marionettes' movements were not driven by some malevolent entity, but were expressions of his inner torment. As the truth dawned on him, Victor felt a profound sense of liberation and anguish. The puppet's curse had been a manifestation of his own psychological state, an external representation of the guilt and trauma he had never fully faced. The Marionette's torment was his own, and to free himself in them, he had to confront the source of his pain. With trembling hands, Victor spoke aloud, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry. I've carried this guilt for so long, never allowing myself to grieve or to face what happened. I'm sorry for not being there, for not accepting the truth of my loss." The theater seemed to respond to Victor's words. The oppressive atmosphere began to lift, the shadows receding as if in response to his confession. The Marionette's movements became less frantic, their once erratic motions slowing and eventually coming to a halt. The air grew lighter, and the sense of malevolence that had pervaded the theater began to dissipate. As Victor's confession continued, he felt a profound sense of release, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The Marionettes, now still and lifeless, seemed to rest peacefully, their once menacing presence transformed into a somber reminder of the journey Victor had undergone. Elena approached the stage, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "Mr. Ashcroft, you did it. You faced your past and set things right." Victor nodded, his gaze fixed on the still figures of the Marionettes. "It was never about a curse or a dark force. It was about coming to terms with my own grief, accepting what happened, and allowing myself to finally let go." The theater, once a place of darkness and despair, now felt transformed. The shadows that had clung to its walls were gone, replaced by a quiet, peaceful stillness. The Marionettes, now silent and unmoving, seemed to be at rest, their curse lifted by Victor's act of redemption. As Victor and Elena left the theater, the storm outside had finally subsided, leaving behind a clear, tranquil sky. The once haunted space now stood as a testament to the power of confronting one's inner demons and the profound relief that comes from facing and accepting the past. Victor's journey had been one of self-discovery and redemption. Curse, which had seemed so powerful and malevolent, was revealed to be a mere reflection of his own psychological state. In confronting his own guilt and trauma, Victor had not only freed himself, but also given the Marionettes the peace they had been denied for so long. The theater, once a place of dark memories, had become a symbol of healing and renewal, a reminder that the true power to overcome one's fears and regrets lies within.